Welcome everyone to this Sciline media briefing on the future of food, a particularly fun media briefing today featuring three experts looking at different aspects of what we might be eating in the years to come, and for some of us already. Before we get started, I just want to take 1 minute to introduce Sciline to those of you who may not be familiar with us. We are a philanthropically funded free service for reporters with one overarching mission, which is to help you get more research-based evidence into your news stories. We have a variety of free services ranging from on-deadline provision of experts for you as you work on stories and realize you need a scientist to talk to the hosting of all expenses paid 2.5-day boot camps on various topics in science, to the creation and web posting of fact sheets on various newsworthy topics around which we see some confusion or misinformation that are especially designed to be easy to use for sort of a hair on fire, on deadline reporter who just needs the facts, and a variety of other services that we encourage you to check out at sciline.org. Today's media briefing on the future of food will feature three experts. The details of their bios are on the website, so I'm not going to take time to go through those right now. I'll just say, as a very brief way of telling you what's coming up, that we've got three folks. First, you're going to hear from Dr. Julie Lesnick, L-E-S-N-I-K. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Wayne State University. She's a biological anthropologist, and I would call her an ambassador for entomophagy, something we at Sciline engaged in this morning as we chowed down on some crickets. At least some of us did. Second, we will hear from Dr. Kate Krueger, who is a cell biologist and research director at New Harvest, which is a nonprofit research institute that supports innovations in cultured meat and cellular agriculture. She will talk about why impossible burgers are in fact possible and what else may be possible in the years ahead. And last, we'll hear from Dr. Denise Skonberg, that's S-K-O-N-B-E-R-G, Associate Professor of Food Science in the Food and Agriculture School at the University of Maine. Her research has focused on improving the economic and environmental sustainability of processed seafood products, including some marine organisms that you may not have thought about eating before. So, to get things started, let's turn to Dr. Julie Lesnick and hear a little bit about the bugs.
Thank you for having me. And so I'm going to talk to you about edible insects as one of the ways that people are considering looking for more efficient ways to feed the growing population. So as we're depleting our resources, people are still increasing in number. And so that's the challenge we're all here discussing. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of numbers, and I think you'll see that the case for insects really speaks for itself in a lot of ways. I do want to give the caveat that each data point I'm giving represents a range. It's highly variable depending on what you feed these animals. So I'm going to be comparing crickets, farming crickets, to traditionally raised livestock. And so all of these efficiencies and all the numbers I'm showing you are very dependent on what those actual farmers are doing. So this is just a brief overview. But to start, a lot of people ask about, are insects actually nutritious? And so comparing them to traditionally raised livestock, you can see that they offer very similar amounts of protein. These are all standardized for 1 kilogram of edible mass. That's over 2 pounds of meat, so that's more than you're eating, but it's just kind of how scientists are best able to standardize this data. But what you can see with the crickets is how much of the micronutrients they offer compared to traditionally raised livestock. Now, this is dependent on the insect species, but one thing you get for eating these insects is that you're actually eating the whole insect. So you're eating the exoskeleton, and so that's why you're getting things like calcium and iron that you aren't getting in as high amounts when you're just eating the flesh of these other animals. But what the numbers I really want to show you are these sustainability numbers. And so to start is how much land these livestock species take. And so this is looking at arable land, so which is just a fancy way of saying farmed land. And so cows take over 200 square meters, and then as your animals get smaller and smaller, they take up less space. And then insects like crickets take very little space. Another benefit is that you can farm insects vertically. So you could take a warehouse in an urban environment and stack containers on top of each other, really minimizing the footprint. And then unlike these other traditionally raised livestock, because we tend to do that, we take our cows and we cram them in a space to try to efficiently turn over our chickens and everything. And it's not really ethical to those animals because it's such a departure from their natural lifestyles. But crickets already like dark, cramped spaces. And so they produce well. They're happy in those spaces and they produce well for us. So it's just kind of another consideration and benefit of thinking to insects instead of raising other animals. One number that I really like to show is water usage. You know, we're worried about droughts, we're worried about our fresh water, and we're wasting so much of it into our agriculture. So to produce that kilogram of edible mass for cows, we're using 22,000 liters of water. Here is where I really wanted to point out that caveat, because all of these numbers, I did forget to say this, all these numbers come from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization statement that came out in 2013. So that's where all this data comes from. And they use less than 1 liter of water for crickets. Where this is based on is the fact that crickets get all their water needs from the food you feed them. You don't have to actually feed them additional water. But you still use water to clean your facilities and all the different processing. So 1 liter is an incredibly idealistic number. So I generally present this more like 100 liters just to be less sensational about the data. But compared to 22,000 liters or 2,300, we're clearly seeing an improvement in that number for farming crickets. And then lastly is greenhouse gas emissions, so carbon output of these processes. And so cows, for instance, are one of our greatest methane producers. And so thinking about ways to come up with edible protein that produces less of those greenhouse gases, crickets are a really appealing option. Now, again, this is variable depending on the species. The reason cows are methane producers is it's a byproduct of digesting cellulose-dense material like grass or hay. And so crickets don't produce that, but termites do. So termites are incredible methane producers. So they are not a good species that we should be thinking of cultivating in large numbers. We'd only be remaking this exact same problem. But this is a benefit that crickets do have. And we are looking at crickets as the kind of pun intended gateway bug, the first one that people are really trying out and is kind of gaining momentum as this food here in North America. And so the next thing I want to show you, though, is kind of a cultural context for some of this. Because here we think of insects as this new food of the future, but people all over the world eat insects. And so even on this map, when you look, what we're seeing is number of insect species consumed per country. And the United States is shaded on there, and that's representing indigenous populations. Insects have been a part of traditional diets here in the United States for a long time. So our aversion to it comes from our European roots. So this idea of not eating insects in Western culture, which is rooted in European history and then their expanse of an empire and where they've colonized and had continual migrations. And so when we're thinking about why we don't eat insects, it's really a story of Europe, and that Europe being in high latitudes, insects aren't available year-round. And in order to make lives for themselves up in Europe, going back to Neanderthals, they had to hunt meat in order to survive in these snow-covered landscapes. And then similarly, we domesticated cattle in that region first around the world for that reason. So eating insects in the summer can give a reprieve from hunting, but it's nutritionally redundant. So it's not an important resource in these northern latitudes. And so if you look at the map, you can see that it's the darkest shaded countries are all near the equator. And so there's a definite relationship of environment and whether or not insects are consumed. But that doesn't answer why we have such a stigma against them. And this is really where my research has focused. And so I started thinking about it, and I started thinking of Columbus traveling from these northern Europe, northern latitudes of Europe, crossing latitudes in a way that he'd never been crossed before, ending up in the Caribbean islands and encountering indigenous people that lived there. And so those people had diets that were vastly different from what Europeans were used to seeing. But what we know about this encounter and the ugly part of this history is that these people were conquered, they were enslaved, genocide, all of these things. And part of what was used to justify this behavior was painting these people as less than human, as animal-like. And the consumption of insects was specifically used as an example of why these people were less than human and why you could justify these behaviors towards enslaving them and taking over their land. And so just want to end with a quote from one of Columbus's companions on his second voyage, Diego Alvarez Chanca. So he says they eat all of the snakes and lizards and spiders and worms that they find upon the ground, so that to my fancy, their bestiality is greater than that of any beast upon the face of the earth. So when we're trying to avoid insects, what we're trying to do is avoid these primitive, savage narratives, and that still exists hundreds of years later today. So if we're going to change this attitude, we got to change this idea of it as primitive and savage and allow younger generations to view insects differently and make this food source available to them.
Fascinating story of biology and culture. Thank you. We will move to Kate Krueger.
Hello. One moment while I share my screen. Hello. So I'm very excited to talk to you today about cultured meat and cellular agriculture. So cellular agriculture, as we define it, is the production of agricultural products from cell cultures rather than whole plants or animals. So there are two types of cellular agriculture that we often talk about. One is called products produced by cells, and those products are products like, for instance, different kinds of milk that are produced by cow proteins instead of those that are produced by standard methods such as being grown in a cow. So the idea that you could insert the genes for, say, a cow milk protein into a yeast organism instead of growing them in the whole organism itself. When it comes to things like meat products, the idea is rather that we would take the whole cell of a chicken and convert that to a chicken breast instead of using the whole chicken organism to make a fillet or a steak. So when we talk about cultured meat, the discussion often goes to a couple products that we're a lot more familiar with these days, and those are the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger. And I want to point out that these are not cultured meat products. These are really exciting technology that has entered the food space recently, and I and others are really thrilled to see it on the market. But I do want to point out that the Beyond Burger is an extrusion-based product that is an extrusion of various plant proteins, and the Impossible Burger has some novel proteins that are really exciting in it. So these are not cultured meat because they do not contain full muscle cells. So while I'm super enthusiastic about these products and would love to talk about them more in a different context, they're really not the topic of my conversation today. So when we're talking about cellular agriculture and the technology that goes into it, what we're talking about is taking cells out of an organism like a cow or a chicken, growing them up on to a material called a scaffold, which organizes the cells and helps them grow in thick quantities. Growing those cells up and then feeding them with a variety of different nutrients and minerals in a bioreactor to make a full steak type product. So that's really the goal of a lot of cellular agriculture, is a full tissue. While we're quite a long ways away from making a full tissue, I estimate it's at least 10 years out from making any kind of steak or sashimi-like product. We're much closer to making a variety of products such as meatballs or chicken nuggets or burgers. So those are more likely to happen in a sort of a 5-year time horizon. So that's a really exciting innovation that will likely take a lot less time. I do want to point out that cellular agriculture technology, to my knowledge, has not yet been scaled. And what that means is we don't yet have the machinery in place to grow lots and lots of cultured meat to the extent that you're going to find it in the grocery store immediately. So substantial research and development, both at startups and in academic context, is needed to make that happen. When it comes to life cycle analyses for cultured meat, which are the main way of assessing the environmental impacts of this technology, the results are surprisingly mixed. Some suggest that cultured meat will be much, much better for the environment. Some suggest it will be a little bit better for the environment. And a few very exciting ones show that there's a lot of promise for different materials, for starting materials for cellular agriculture, such as algae-based starting materials. These have the most promising results. So that's really exciting going forward when we talk about how these products could affect the environment. I do want to point out, since none of the production for any of these materials has yet been scaled, it's really hard to estimate the exact cost of these materials going forward, either on the environment or in terms of a dollar amount. So in terms of the regulatory and legislative developments in this space, the conversation has really picked up recently. In 2018, there were a number of various acts that came before different parties and different legislative updates that were really exciting, including the FDA and the USDA getting involved in the conversation. And as of 2009, the USDA and the FDA have announced a formal agreement to co-regulate cellular agriculture processes. Another exciting kind of development that I think is worth noting is acts like the Real Meat Act that's recently been written for Congress, which is an act that says that it's a sort of an agreement to try to get the language out there around meat products such that the term meat can only be used for meat derived from a full animal organism rather than a cell culture. So that's kind of an interesting level of pushback that started to occur from some meat producing groups. So there's often kind of a push-pull in the field between a lot of enthusiasm about these new products and a lot of potential pushback from different people who grow these animals. So when it comes to what kind of background reading is really useful, I've put a few links here that you can take a look at, and I'm happy to talk to you more if you have any particular questions regarding this technology. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate. Really, really interesting work there. And we'll move up to Denise Skomberg.
Okay, so hopefully everybody can see this. So hi everyone. So I'm going to be talking about edible seaweeds today, which are also known as marine macroalgae, sea greens, sea vegetables. And they're divided into 3 different categories based on their pigmentation. So they're called red, green, or brown. And normally they're attached to substrates in the marine environment, or they could be free floating. And also the ones that we eat, they can be either wild or they can be farm raised. And the main thing I wanted to show you in this slide, one of the main things is looking at these seaweeds at the bottom of the slide, I really wanted to show you the incredible diversity among species. There are thousands of species of seaweeds, and they vary a lot in terms of their appearance, their color, their nutritional value, their texture, and their flavor. So, so there's a lot of diversity there, which I'll be referring back to. And also in the top right corner of this slide, I just wanted to show you, this is a seaweed farmer in Maine who's just pulled up a line of sugar kelp. And so you can see this line normally grows just under the surface of the water. So why are we promoting seaweeds and seaweed consumption? And compared to land-based agriculture, some of the benefits include that seaweeds don't require fertilizers, don't require feed, they don't require fresh water, and they don't require land. So those are a lot of benefits there. They also provide a lot of environmental benefits, and 2 of the main ones that are brought up a lot are the fact that they are nitrogen and carbon sequestrants, which benefit the environment. They also have a very short growth cycle. Some of them you can harvest within 2 or 3 months. And as I already mentioned, there's hundreds of species. So if, for example, if consumers don't like one of the varieties of seaweeds, well then there's so many other ones that they could try that might have the flavor or texture that they're looking for. And then also another key benefit of them is they're extremely nutrient dense. They're primarily noted for their really high content of dietary fiber, which we know is really lacking in the American diet. They're also a rich source of vitamins and minerals and a lot of different types of phytonutrients as well. So looking in the top right corner of the slide, this is the global seaweed production. And the main thing I wanted you to see here was that seaweed production has increased pretty dramatically over like the last 10 years. Between 2007 and 2015, you can see that it doubled. And most of that doubling, it was due primarily to aquaculture, which is, you know, the farm raising of seaweed as opposed to the wild harvest. And that currently the value of the seaweed, at least the last data from the FAO, showed that they were valued at about $6 billion a year. So there's a lot of value associated with them, but most of that value is going to Asia, where most of this stuff is grown, predominantly in China, also Indonesia, Korea. That's where you see a lot of this being grown and harvested. We'd like to see a change. We'd like to see US contribute to some of this production and consumption as well. So what are some of the benefits about doing it in the US? Well, we have a lot of clean water. So the East Coast and the West Coast, particularly the northern parts, if you look at Washington, Alaska, Maine, up to Canada, New England, there's a lot of clean water and a lot of potential for growing seaweeds in these areas. In the last 5 years, a lot of new farms have been launched in these areas, which has been a good thing to see. And part of it has been in response to this growing foodie movement that we see in the United States. And by foodie here, I'm trying to encompass a variety of different groups and movements here, including, like the traditional foodies or people who are interested in trying new cuisines. They're more adventurous in their dietary choices. It also includes a lot of people interested in locally sourced foods. People are interested in more natural foods with bioactive properties. And also people who are interested in sustainably produced foods. So all of these things are drivers to seaweed consumption and seaweed farms here in the United States. But there are definitely challenges to moving forward. And the biggest thing is that there's just a big lack of familiarity about seaweeds, first among American consumers, but also if you look at processors, and in terms of infrastructure to get these products from growing all the way to getting them to American consumers' plates. So there's a lot of questions that need to be addressed with regards to this. And as a food scientist, those are some of the things that we're looking at. We're looking at a lot of the food-related research questions, starting with something just as simple as, what is the shelf life of fresh seaweed? Right? These are questions that were answered for, cauliflower and broccoli hundreds of years ago, but we have no idea. So this is where we're starting. What's the best way to process these products? Like blanching them, freezing them, drying them. And given that since there's so many different seaweed varieties, what works for one variety may not be best for another. And then another key thing is, how do we market these things to American consumers who might not be that familiar? So I've got a couple pictures of products here, and the one here on the left here is one that a lot of people might be familiar with, and that's basically the nori sheets that are wrapped around sushi products. And this is the way that most consumers, if they'd had seaweed, most of them have probably had it in this form. Another form that's been developed in the last couple years, and on the bottom right here you can see, is these seaweed snacks. And seaweed snacks, it's a really good way to get into a new market because Americans are incredible snackers, and snacks in general are a pretty low risk way to try a new food product. This one on the bottom that I wanted to show you is a product developed here in Maine called a kelp cube, which is a frozen pureed kelp cube, which is designed to appeal to people who like to eat smoothies. So they can just throw this kelp cube into their smoothie to try and give it a little extra an extra sort of boost of nutrients for their products. So that's where I want to end on the seaweed, and I want to just spend a short amount of time talking about something completely different, the green crab. And so some of you may not be aware that the green crab is an invasive species that is originally from Europe, but at this point it's deeply entrenched on both coasts of the United States. And if you look at this map here from the USGS, in the brown stippled areas on both coasts, you can see the green crab is all the way up here in Maine and actually into Canada, and then down to the mid-Atlantic area on the east, and on the west all the way from the middle of California all the way up through Washington. And the problem with these invasive green crab is they're extremely predatory, and they love eating things that we would like to eat, right? They're extremely efficient predators on soft-shell clams, and in fact, they were associated with a huge drop in the soft-shell clam fishery here in Maine. But they also can attack mussels and oysters, which is a big concern for the aquaculture on the West Coast. Another thing, I'm showing you this picture here on the right, is they have intensive burrowing activity. And so they've also been shown to decimate eelgrass beds and salt marshes, which is what this is. This is a salt marsh here in Maine. So what we're doing is we're looking at potential food utilization streams for green crab. And the biggest problem associated with eating green crab is the fact that they're so small. You can see this picture in the middle, they're really tiny. They're about a third or half the size of species that we're more familiar with, which are like the blue crab or Dungeness crab. They're really, really tiny. And because of that, it's extremely difficult to try and pick their crab meat and have the kind of jumbo lump crab meat that we are used to consuming. So because of that, we haven't really made use of this resource. But one way they can be eaten, and which is very lucrative, and fishers can get about $20 to $25 a pound for them, is if they're in a soft shell state. And this picture here on the top right shows a picture of a soft shell green crab that was battered and breaded and fried. And this goes like, like flapjacks or something. They're really, really popular. Unfortunately for fishers, the soft shell crab only represent less than 1% of the crab that are harvested. So the question is, what should we do with the rest of the crab? So some of the work we're doing at the University of Maine has been focused on taking the other 99%, putting them through a mechanical separator, which divides the crab up into a minced meat stream and this ground shell stream. And then we're looking at what can we do with this minced meat stream, which is a nutritious product, but is basically a meat paste. And so there's a lot of research questions to try and address some of the issues with that, to see how can we incorporate that into foods that people would like to eat. And as I end right here, I just want to do a shout out to greencrab.org, which is here. They made this cookbook, the Green Crab Cookbook, on the left. And basically it's a nonprofit organization, and their mission is to try and develop markets for green crab so that we can develop a fishery, which can then help mitigate some of the problems with this invader along our coasts.
But we need to eat our way out of the invasive species problems. Fantastic. Thank you all for those introductory presentations. And folks can now go down to the, I think, the lower area of your screen, where there's an opportunity to type in questions, which I'll be happy to convey over to the speakers. Let us know if you want to direct that to one speaker or all of them more generally. And we'll start right off with a question that we have here from Gloria Dickey, who's a freelance reporter, asking, would there be issues, and I take it this is for you, Denise, would there be issues with ocean pollution and seaweed aquaculture with regard to, say, microplastics in the water, or maybe related to that, wondering whether seaweed concentrate toxins the way some plants might do so in the land, and worry about cleanliness that way?
That's a great question. I have not heard anything about microplastics with regards to seaweed. That's an area I don't think that's really been looked into yet. It doesn't seem like it would be, but that there's definitely research is needed. But with the other issues you brought up, yes, in fact, it depends on the species of algae, of macroalgae that you're talking about. So research is underway that really is looking at how well different types of species can concentrate heavy metals in their tissue. And some that are of interest include arsenic. Arsenic is one that's of interest. And research has shown that some of the brown macroalgae tend to do it at a much higher rate than the green or the red macroalgae. But even within the brown macroalgae, there's varieties among species, so that's important. And another key thing is that the region where it's harvested plays a huge, huge role. So this is an issue in terms of food safety that has to be addressed and has to be researched further to make sure that if it is specifically a brown seaweed, to monitor the waters and to monitor the quality of the products coming out of those areas.
Interesting, great. A question here from Jenny Splitter, who's also a freelancer we've worked with, for Dr. Lesnick. Have there been any efforts to improve the taste on crickets, specifically the mealiness? That sounds like a subjective judgment there, but there you go.
I don't know. I can't speak on the mealiness. I've never actually used that adjective for it. But I think that the biggest thing people are doing is just grinding them up into powder, you know. So if you get rid of the legs and the eyes and the antennae and you make it into something that doesn't remind us of a bug, even though we eat crabs that are giant sea bugs, but you know, there are people that are like playing around with like finishing them with basil and seeing if, like, you know, if they eat basil last, do they taste like basil? So, I mean, there's people like artisan raising them and testing those things out. But for the most part, people are not messing around with sort of like selective breeding yet to adjust for taste. I believe that will be in the future. But I just wanted to point out something really interesting, like sort of similarities between insects and what, you know, my colleagues were talking about, is that similarly, like, we are still in an R&D phase with understanding, processing, and growing. What's the shelf life? All of these questions that we were just talking about for algae are very relevant to insects as well. And similar to the cultured meat, scale, right? So most cricket farms have been very small. So thinking about a Nestle bought, you know, large facility, what the impacts of that would be. So we don't really know scale. We don't really know all of the details of processing. It's still a very young field, and most of the work is being done really to change perceptions right now.
We have a similar question actually for Dr. Krueger, which asks from Max Levy, a freelance science reporter, what are some of the challenges for scaling up cultured meat bioreactors?
Definitely. So the number one challenge for scaling up cultured meat bioreactors is the media, or the food for the cells. So traditionally, a lot of the media sources for cells that would be used for something like cultured meat tend to be really expensive for a few different reasons. They usually either contain a fraction of fetal cow blood, which would make products not vegan and is also fairly expensive, or they would contain recombinant proteins, so proteins that you would make in different cell lines and through largely expensive processes. So costs on that media is going to need to come down drastically for cultured meat to become an affordable product on the market. Besides that, bioreactor design really hasn't been scaled effectively yet. So we still don't know exactly what kinds of bioreactors would be used for scaled production. So that's going to be a big open question in the field.
We have a closely related question. Perhaps you've answered it as much as possible, but I'll mention this from Melody Baumgartner. She's at Chemical and Engineering News, asking you, Dr. Krueger, you know, about any specific advances for making low-cost animal-free serum or nutrients. Are there any more details on that? How those nutrients are going to be made? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there are some companies that do make proprietary formulations of these products. So it's not as though they aren't available, and it's not as though these processes are impossible. There's likely some R&D that will need to be done to get them low enough cost to make things like meat, for instance. Oftentimes those alternatives I've talked about tend to be fairly high cost, and also their formulae aren't really available. But this is fairly tractable science, so I suspect there will be a solution to it in not all that long.
And are there deep-pocketed companies that are already in this area, or is it still largely an academic exercise?
So far, there are a number of startups that are actively engaged in questions like this, over 20. And there are some large companies that are getting very interested in this topic. So I think that may be on the horizon if it hasn't happened yet.
Question for Dr. Lesnick. Are there insect diseases that one needs to worry about in farm-raised insects?
Yeah, so anything that not zoonotic diseases, like nothing that we're worried about contracting ourselves. So of course there's like a fungus that can kill a cricket population, and so it's a problem for production for the cricket farmers, but nothing in terms of contracting ourselves. And part of that is, in terms of zoonotic diseases, we're more likely to transfer diseases to closely related species. So a cow is at much greater risk of harming us than an insect, which is so distantly related to us. Another point that I can bring up here is that thinking about this transfer of diseases, so much of our issue in our agricultural system is from runoff of agricultural waste. So we have problems with spinach and lettuce having E. coli, but it's not the spinach and lettuce that have that E. coli, it's runoff from the concentrated feeding operations of cows and pigs. And so one, insects don't have those diseases that are so easily transferable to us, but two, the waste is so much easier to manage with insects. They produce a fluffy, powdery waste that we call frass, and it's really easy to collect that and use it for a fertilizer, and kind of continue kind of more of a closed-looped food system being the ultimate kind of goal with insects as food. So it really is not a concern, but so many people think of insects as disease transmitters, but that's because like if we were wild foraging them, you don't know if they went through the cow runoff. Like that's really the problem, but them themselves, especially if they're farmed for human consumption, are completely safe.
Fluffy waste. That's got to be the first time I've heard those two words together. That's interesting. Okay, let's see. We have something from Amanda McCracken, who's a freelance reporter, asking if any of the panelists could speak about how concerns about global warming or how global warming itself really may be affecting what foods consumers may choose to eat or may have available to eat, and whether that might affect the capacity to grow some of the foods we're talking about here positively or negatively. Maybe we could just work through all three of you to see about how climate change intersects with the work you're doing. Dr. Lesnick, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, one is that with climate change, we're worried about things like our fresh water and all of that. And so people are looking at insects as a way of using these resources more efficiently. But one thing that made me think of that I wanted to bring up here is another kind of problem with kind of global climate change right now is what people are calling an insect apocalypse, meaning we have so many insect species going extinct right now. There are more insect species than we could ever count. We have no idea how biodiverse they are, but we know their numbers are reducing. And so a lot of times when I talk about edible insects, in terms of this sort of climate change, looking for new food resources, I'll often get pushback. It's like, but no, there's an insect apocalypse. How could you say we should be eating insects? And what I'm talking about is farmed insects. And that's actually the best thing we can do for an insect apocalypse, because if we can eat more of our protein coming from insect food sources, we're eating less soy, we're eating less cow that's being fed the corn and whatever, and so we're using less pesticides. All of that requires pesticides, and that's hurting our insects in this insect apocalypse. And so by eating insects, we're using those resources less and reducing our reliance on pesticides.
Dr. Schoenberg, what's going on with food from the sea with regard to climate change?
Well, with regards to the things I was talking about today, particularly the seaweeds and the green crab, with regards to seaweed, there is a concern about it, particularly here because in the US, we're looking at developing some of these seaweed species. We're starting off by looking at ones that do well in temperate waters. And that includes things like sugar kelp, bull kelp. I mean, there's a lot of kelps. So a lot of the kelp species, and also dulse, which also does really well in this kind of environment. And so there's a concern, is like we're starting to launch into growing these, and now as the water is already starting to warm up, are these species that we've chosen, are they going to do very well? And so one of the big ways to try and combat that is that people who are actually phycologists, which are actually people who study seaweeds themselves as opposed to food scientists, they're looking at the genetic diversity, going out globally and trying to find and study which ones would do better as the environment starts to warm up. And specifically of the kelps that we're growing here in Maine, one of the kelps called wing kelp, they found will probably do better as the Gulf of Maine waters start to warm up. They may outperform something like sugar kelp, which has been the predominant crop that's been raised so far. So yeah, it is an important issue. And just in general, I would say ensuring the genetic diversity of the seaweed species that are grown, that's really, really key. And something that the farm fish industry didn't really think about when they took off. And I feel like we know now that genetic diversity is so important in agricultural populations. And so since we're just starting to launch this year, I feel that that needs to inform all the decisions that are made about what types of seaweed species are grown here. So I think it's really, really important. And we do have an advantage by knowing this ahead of time.
Interesting point.
Yeah, and then with regards to green crab, some of the researchers that have been looking into it are saying that the warming waters is making their numbers go up even faster.
I just saw the report that 2019 was the warmest year on record yet for ocean temperatures. So something to watch for.
Yeah.
Great. And Dr. Krueger on climate
Yes,
change?
I couldn't agree more. So climate change is definitely something on people's minds when they get interested in cellular agriculture. That's one of the top concerns people cite when they reach out to us. And the good news is that it seems quite likely that cellular agriculture processes will be better in terms of reduced energy costs and reduced water needs. So while there's no guarantee on that, based on those life cycle assessments that I mentioned earlier, it does seem like there's some promise for that, especially when algae is used as a starting material to feed the cells.
Great. And another question for you, Dr. Krueger, from Knubel Sheik at the New York Times, asking what happens to the waste generated in bioreactors once cells are done using or growing in the media? And are there any solutions that might help the waste problem as cellular agriculture scales up?
That's a great question. So there's been a lot of talk about this. While production has not been scaled, so this hasn't really hit the market in any way. None of the bioreactors are creating waste yet at scale. There's a lot of talk about how one could make the system circular and could filter used media and put it back in the system to especially save things like water. Certain components may be used up through the production of meat, so those would need to be replenished if there were a filtration sort of system. But that could likely be a way to reduce waste streams.
Through the magic of an instantaneity of Twitter, I can now tell you that Kabul's name is actually Kabul, not Knubel. The N is silent. Okay, we move on for the record. Something from Karen Coates asking basically whether some of these foods that we're talking about in the future are going to end up really being just niche foods for the wealthy, or are they really going to help solve problems of global hunger around the world? It certainly seems at the beginning like it's going to be expensive. Does anyone want to address that question?
I'm happy to jump in because
Apologies.
Cellular agriculture is often cited as something that will likely be very expensive at first. The Impossible Burger had high costs when it first came out relative to other ground meat products, and it's likely that cellular agriculture products will as well. That said, I think there's a big drive to reduce those costs, and as R&D is scaled, those costs will naturally come down. So I think the goal was really widespread consumption, and I think it's possible that these products may be able to have added benefits relative to those of conventional meat, such as nutraceuticals potentially, or other health implications that could be really positive relative to standard meat that's available. So I think that's certainly a goal of the space and something that everyone's working towards, although likely it will be expensive first before those costs come down.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that dynamic?
So yeah, I can say something about insects as food in that regard. In terms of it is feeding hungry people. So one of the benefits I see of insects as food in this is actually its ability to help solve these problems of hunger, because one wonderful thing about it is that you can farm them for yourself at a small scale that is very cost effective. It's not a lot of startup equipment. It's just a plastic box with different trays. So it's really easy to provide for people. The problem is the stigma. And especially if we're thinking about going to other countries and being like, well, we don't eat bugs in the US, but here we think you should, is incredibly insulting. The other problem is that even in countries where people do eat insects, they don't eat all species of insects. So they have insects they choose to eat, and they have ones they also find disgusting. So it's a lot about kind of the culture change of it, but the potential of being able to control your own protein source through farming your own insects is great.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Actually, I would like to say something about starting off with the seaweed. In fact, in this country, Seaweed is currently a niche market, but what I would like to see, if we could get away from just the dried products to see it more like a vegetable, to have a wide variety of vegetables in the supermarket next to your kale and your spinach, having a variety of fresh seaweeds there as well. And I think it'll be a while to get there. And it's not so much, yes, production things have to be overcome, but I think a lot of it just has to do with getting consumers used to trying new kinds of food products. And in fact, lots of people don't eat many different kinds of vegetables. I mean, I know people only eat corn and potato. So they're not going to start eating it, but I think a lot of other people would. And with regards to with the rest of the world, lots of the world already, we already know tons of people in Asia are already consuming lots and lots of seaweed. So it's not like it's a really expensive kind of product that's only for the elite. And with regards to green crab, I envision that would be it would be a very low cost product. The main thing is figuring out how to transform it into a way that people are really going to want to eat those products.
We have another question from Max Levy, freelance reporter. Are cellular alternatives to eggs a possibility, or are the resources required per calorie not as high as for beef or chicken meats?
That's a great question. So I've never heard of any attempts to use cellular agriculture whole cells to make eggs. That said, there are a lot of efforts to make the proteins for eggs. Both proteins that are similar, kind of simulacra proteins that are from plants, which would not be cellular agriculture, and different kinds of protein technologies that involve the use of genetic modification to create the products, which are cellular agriculture. So there's currently a company called Clara Foods that's doing this production right now. So that would be the best example of these processes.
So with egg proteins, I could imagine a cell-based scrambled, but maybe not hard-boiled or over medium.
Yes, most likely at first, at least.
Cool. A general question for Dr. Lesnick looks like, are there other promising insects being evaluated as food sources other than crickets? I guess there's someone out here with a hankering for bugs, but they're not really crazy about crickets. What options can we offer them?
The other insect that we have kind of data on to start farming for human consumption is mealworms. So both crickets and mealworms have a long established pet food trade, so actually farming them for an industry. And so the regulations, and this is a question that didn't come up, that I just want to speak on quick, is sort of the regulations that aren't quite there yet that are allowing this industry to grow as it's potentially could. For instance, like the FDA has regulations on how many insect parts you can accidentally eat, but no real good regulations on if you choose to eat insects. So a lot of the large buyers are kind of waiting for those regulations to come through because they want to know that they can trust the sources, and that totally makes sense. But the one thing that people are able to do is, one, the regulations are state by state, and the one thing that is being done is that the insects need to be produced at a facility just for human consumption. So when you're eating crickets or mealworms that are farmed from these facilities, they're not the same as the pet food. The standards of cleanliness and the processing facilities are what are there for processing any food for humans. But the technology, that's where we had a leg up and a good place to start. So there is, in terms of taste, mealworms are nuttier when crickets have a little bit more of a seafood taste. So they do have a more pungent, strong flavor, a kind of a strong aroma, and mealworms tend to blend in easier, more like nuts. However, mealworms are a beetle larva, so you have to, harvesting is a little trickier because you have to catch them in that life stage, as opposed to crickets that we eat in their adult form.
Got it. All right. A question from Ivan Amato, who's the editor of the Moonshot catalog. Are there opportunities to expand seaweed and other ocean cultured foods in deeper regions of the ocean? What opportunities are there to expand mariculture? And if so, what concerns would accompany expansion into some of those areas?
Yeah, I read a paper about this recently. And again, I'm not involved in the actual production, but yes, there are concerns about just growing them in nearshore coastal waters because there's the potential to interfere with other users. And so there is work that's being done to try and take it out into deeper water. And I'd say the major concerns that have to be solved with that are engineering, right? There's a lot of engineering issues that need to be addressed to make sure that they can grow them out there. And one of the things I read said what they'd be interested in is growing them out in deep sea waters, away from shipping, away from like coastal utilization, most of the growth cycle out there. And then when they're almost ready to be harvested, then bringing it in, like if it's being grown on rafts or something like that, bringing that in to the nearshore area just prior to harvest. But that is a lot of aquaculture engineering that needs to be addressed to make sure to actually make that feasible on a large scale.
Great. And we're just about wrapping up. I do have a follow-up question here from Melody Baumgartner at Chemical and Engineering News asking what metrics such as LCA or cost are important to think about when using insects and algae or seaweed as livestock or aquaculture feed.
So I can speak to that quickly, is that in terms of insects for livestock feed, our industry for that is way beyond where we are for insects as human food. So we're kind of able to let them do a lot of the R&D and then we can kind of follow behind. And they're getting funding. They have a lot better funding coming from government agencies because the idea of feeding bugs to an animal is much easier to get by reviewers than feeding bugs to people. And so the insect species that's being researched the most there is black soldier fly larvae. Black soldier fly larvae eat anything. They're incredibly wonderful at reducing waste. So you can feed them any kind of leftover waste foods, and then they can convert it into bioavailable nutrients that you can then feed to chicken and fish and other livestock. So a lot of the work is being done on that species, like life cycle analysis, like breeding, like males, females, like how do you get the optimum breeding qualities, like all of this is being done in that field where it isn't quite there for humans. And so there's an abundant literature out there for black soldier flies in terms of their life cycle assessment and these cost things that aren't quite there for insects. So that's about the basics I can give you, but it's really easy to kind of find more info on them if you go look.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think we have one last question here, and this has to do with cultured meat, asking whether once it's available to consumers, could we expect any kind of health benefits? Is it not simply the environmental benefits of not using animals, but might this be even better for us than meat?
Quite possibly. So I think that's one of the real key potential benefits of cellular agriculture is once you've gone to all the trouble of growing up cells individually for food production and got them in a bioreactor and got them growing, you've overcome a number of technical hurdles. And what that would mean is a lot of other modifications to those cells might be, by comparison, a bit straightforward. So that would include potentially growing cells that produce their own antioxidants, or growing cells with healthier fats so that in theory you could get a better omega-3 profile similar to salmon, for instance. Those would be two pretty straightforward examples. Also, depending on the scaffold materials used, so what the cells are growing on, it's quite possible you could up the fiber content of meat, so people might get a healthier meat that way. The possibilities are endless. So it's once you've got that much modification going on, you can kind of think about how the sky's the limit a little bit for where you could go with that.
An inspiring wrap, I think, there. I want to thank our three experts, Dr. Lesnick, Dr. Schoenberg, Dr. Krueger, for fascinating presentations and Q&A today. I want to remind folks who are tuned in right now three things. One, we encourage you to come to us when you need help with your stories. Don't forget our matching service where we can hook you up on deadline with all kinds of experts to help you get more actual research results and science into your stories. Follow us on Twitter at RealSciLine. And one last thing, those of you who are attending right now, when you shut this thing down, we'll get a notification for a short survey. This literally will take you 30 seconds, and it will literally help us do a better job as we move forward with future media briefings and other activities. So please take those 30 seconds and answer 3 quick questions for us to help us out. We appreciate that, and we appreciate all of you being involved today. Thanks, and we look forward to talking to many of you again at the next SciLine Media Briefing.